ultimately, our goal is to build client relationships, help clients achieve the end, right? Help clients achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve. So if the client ends up making bad decisions because we haven't prepared them adequately, then we run the risk of either losing the book or not growing the book in the way that we could had we done a better job. So I think that's the biggest key to take away is we have the ability to get to a right map, and we have a better focus now as far as the right destination. So let's talk about that. That's the right information. In other words, if after I printed off my map, something changed, maybe there's nasty road construction, really this gets down to the idea of diversification. So with diversification, we'll talk about 3 core points. First off, what is diversification? Second, I think we all know, but is it good? And then third, how do you check for diversification? In order to get started, let's give you a choice. You can have a single stock that has 10% upside, 10% downside, and an expected annual return of 7%. The second option would be an index fund that has exactly the same risk and return profile. If I gave you a choice between those two, I'm going to bet the vast majority of you are going to choose the second option. You're going to choose the index fund. And the reason is, intuitively as advisors, we know that a more diversified portfolio eliminates idiosyncratic risk, or that thing that comes out of left field. Maybe the CFO is cooking the books, what have you. So we're going to choose the more diversified option given the exact same risk-return profile. But how do we check for diversification? Really, asset allocation historically has been our best mechanism for checking for diversification, setting up correlation matrices and testing against the correlation of the assets in the portfolio. The other major way you see is a portfolio x-ray, if you will, kind of looking into the holdings of mutual funds or ETFs that you might own and seeing if there's overlap in the underlying holdings. Those seem to be the 2 major ways that folks are checking for diversification in the advisor space today. Now, another question. Now let's say you had a 50-50 portfolio, 50% SPY and 50% AG. And the question would be, are you dramatically more diversified than if you held only SPY, if you held only an S&P 500 index? The answer to me would seem immediately, absolutely. You know, I've got all stock or I've got 50-50 stock bond mix. You know, intuitively we would think that that would be a much more diversified portfolio. So let's kick it off with that definition of diversification, Ron.
Yeah, so diversification is a very interesting topic, right? And then it can mean different things to different people. But you know, we in the quant world, you know, in God we trust, but everybody else needs to bring data. So maybe we can come up to a formula where everybody agrees. So at the ground level, when we think about diversification, it means that when one asset zigs, the other assets zag, right? And so let's take a simple example. Let's say we have a portfolio 1 here, which is made of 40% ABC, 60% XYZ. And then here are the sequence of returns for this portfolio. So 5% year 1, minus 3% year 2. Year 3 we got minus 10% and then plus 6. You look at XYZ, well, XYZ was at negative 12% and then plus 7 in years 3 and 4. Let's look now at portfolio 2. Portfolio 2 is also made of 40% ABC and 60% GHY, the different asset. And so you see in years 3 and 4, GHY doesn't seem to have a huge negative impact, and then on year 4 doesn't have to have a huge positive impact. And so if we had to ask, well, is 1 more diversified than 2? Obviously in portfolio 2, things zigs when the other thing zags, versus portfolio 1, they tend to move in the same direction at the same time. Does that make sense? So based on that, what we can do is come up with a workable definition of diversification. And so what we could do is just say, well, I'm going to measure every risk individually, right? So if I have like ABC in my portfolio, what's the risk of my ABC position? Then if I have XYZ in my portfolio, what's the risk of XYZ? If I add those two together, and the portfolio risk is exactly equal to the sum of the two, it means that those two risks didn't cancel each other. Does that make sense? So in this example, let's say I have 3 asset classes, and the sum of individual risks is $86,000, but my portfolio risk is only $50,000. It means that $36,000 get diversified away, right? So we have a way now to objectively measure how much risk get diversified away by comparing the portfolio risk with the sum of the individual risks. And in this case, we got 42%.
Now here's a question for you though, because we've all witnessed during a downturn, what ends up happening? All of a sudden you can't count on the correlations that might have existed during regular markets or during good markets to hold true. During a downturn, everything kind of seems to move differently or together.
Correct, and you know this intuitively. Every risk manager, every quant out there knows this, is correlations tend to go to 1 when there's a stress to the system, right? So the correlation number, again, that's something that comes from history. Very few people really use it. Again, because those things are not set in stone. They change dramatically, and it's kind of like having your airbag that doesn't deploy when you need it. So this measure of comparing individual risk versus portfolio risk is a lot more robust.